introduce myself if you don't know who I am. My name's Leslie Goddard. I'm a historian. I have a background in both history and museum work. I have a master's degree in museum studies and a PhD in history. And I specifically am interested in women's history. And I've always been interested in the topic of Betty Crocker, but got very interested in it this year when the pandemic began. And that is because so many people started reporting that they were doing a lot more cooking and baking at home. In fact, have you seen recently, just within the last month or two, they've come out with studies that it looks like butter sales for 2020 are going to be up 20% from what they were in 2019. That's 20% increase in sales, despite the fact that so many restaurants are not buying the amount of butter that they used to be. It's incredible. And part of the reason, well, much of the reason is because we're doing much more cooking and baking. But a lot of it is, let me back up a minute. When I first realized this was in March, when I started seeing a lot of images coming up on Facebook and other social media accounts like this. People trying baking projects that didn't work out. People posting pictures of their burnt cookies or their cakes and bread that didn't rise correct, cookies that smoosh together and cakes that don't come out looking very much like cakes. Instagram and Facebook were filled with images like this at the beginning of the pandemic. And maybe you've had some issues like this yourself if you've tried baking recently and had similar results. What's interesting to me, though, as a historian, is that the problems that some bakers have been having this year are actually not that different from problems bakers have been having at any other time in history. America's first lady of food, Betty Crocker, was actually born out of people trying to get good results from baking. This is a 1930s Betty Crocker ad. And if you look over on the left, there's a little paragraph saying why the wrong flour spoiled this cake. So who is Betty Crocker? If you grew up in America, I'm guessing you might know her name. A lot of people know the name, but not a lot of people know much about her. In fact, when I started doing this research, I Googled Betty Crocker. And one of the suggested questions that came up was, when did Betty Crocker die? Which got me thinking, was Betty Crocker even real? It's one of those names we know, but we don't even know if she's real or not. Well, it turns out Betty Crocker was not real. She never existed as a real person. She was the brainchild of an advertising department, specifically the advertising department of Washburn Crosby Company. This was a Minneapolis-based flour company. If you have good eyesight, you might be able to see over on the right. Their most famous product was gold medal flour. In the 1880s, they had a particular flour that happened to win a gold medal at a flour milling competition and became their most famous product. In fact, it was probably of all the products that Washburn Crosby made and advertised, gold medal flour comes up most often. And it was gold medal flour that kickstarted Betty Crocker's career. And it's a cute story how it happened. In 1921, Washburn Crosby placed an ad for its gold medal flour on the back cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Remember that great magazine? It had these wonderful illustrations. So on the back cover, Washburn Crosby took out an ad that was a puzzle of an old-fashioned from our perspective, Main Street. It was a puzzle. Here's what the puzzle looked like completed. When you got it, it was all misorganized. You cut out the triangles, assembled it into this cute little Main Street. Here's a close-up on it. Sent it into Washburn Crosby to receive a prize. The prize was a pincushion in the shape of a sack of gold medal flour. Well, they got great response. They got 30,000 or so completed puzzles. But here's the thing. Along with the completed puzzles, people around the country, and usually they were women, homemakers, were sending in questions about baking problems that they were having. They got questions like, why does my cake always crack on top? Or how do I keep my pie crust from burning? Or why didn't my bread rise? Now, in hindsight, this is not that surprising. People have always had difficulty when it comes to baking, getting good, consistent results. But of course, in the 1920s, from our perspective, things were a lot less precise than they are today. Here's a typical 1920s kitchen. In those days, many people still worked in ovens that weren't calibrated by temperature. You had to work by hot, moderate, low oven, things like that. Pan sizes had become standardized in the early 20th century, but they weren't in universal usage. So sometimes that affected your baking results. There weren't even many cookbooks in 1920 compared to the number of cookbooks we have today. So it's maybe not that surprising people were having trouble. Washburn Crosby, however, realized the flood of letters that they were getting from people needing advice was kind of a marketing opportunity. They did in this time what they'd always done, which is to go to the Washburn Crosby staff of home economists. Like a lot of companies related to food products, they had a staff of home economists, and they were usually women. This is a late 1940s publicity photo. But in the 1920s, they went to their staff and they asked this staff to write letters back to any consumers who'd written in with their puzzle. And then they went a step further. The advertising department head, who was a guy named Samuel Gale, being a smart ad man, reasoned that they could build a stronger relationship with their female homemaker customers by having the letters come out over a woman's signature. In other words, he reasoned a homemaker would take advice more receptively from someone who was also a woman like her. So he invented a kind of female chief of correspondence, this fictitious woman that the Washburn Crosby Ad Company named Betty Crocker. Here's an early typed up letter. This is a woman who had written in with questions about high altitude baking. So from then on, starting in the fall of 1921, letters from Washburn Crosby having to do with baking or cooking or domestic budgeting, anything like that, went out under Betty Crocker's name. So where'd they get the name Betty Crocker? Well, Crocker actually came from a recently retired director of Washburn Crosby, William G. Crocker. I bet he never anticipated his name would go down in history. Betty was chosen simply because it had a warm, down-to-earth, wholesome kind of quality. Betty was actually the fourth most popular woman's name in America in the 1920s. So it conveyed that friendliness they wanted her to have. So they started sending out these letters, and they actually even took a survey among the female staff at Washburn Crosby. They asked them to submit what they thought should be Betty Crocker's signature. Here is the winning entry. It came from a secretary named Florence Lindeberg. I bet she never knew that her handwriting would go down in history, because her Betty Crocker signature was used at the closing of any Washburn Crosby domestic correspondence. So pretty soon, Washburn Crosby's got dozens of women writing these letters, and the word about it spread, so much so that they actually had to hire more home economists to start regularly responding to letters and giving out advice for baking problems and providing foolproof recipes, things like that. She kind of is becoming the Dear Abby of baking. And part of the popularity might have been because it wasn't just advice that she was providing, it was the way she provided advice, that friendly voice that seemed to come with how she phrased things, giving reassurance to cooks. They could do it. All they needed was a little help, and she was there to help solve any problems that might arise. Do you notice in this publicity photo that these women are wearing white coats? They're in a domestic kitchen setting, but they've got a little bit more of an air of authority because of their white coats, that sort of professional look that they've got in this publicity photo. Again, within a few years, Washburn Crosby had a domestic service staff of 21 people. They actually nicknamed the Crockerettes. And they started not just writing letters and giving out advice, but traveling around, giving cooking demonstrations. Anytime that let's say, a church women's club or a home economics class, when they wrote Washburn Crosby and asked if Betty Crocker could come and talk to their group, the company would send out one of these Crockerettes to do it. They always sort of skirted around the fact that they weren't actually Betty Crocker. And they would always say to their groups, when you're in Minneapolis, stop by Washburn Crosby and say hello. And then when the people really did show up, the staff would have to skirt around the fact that, they couldn't really meet Betty Crocker. They would say, oh, we're all part of the Betty Crocker family. And technically that was true, but they had to keep Kleenex on hand for the particularly weepiest of fans. Here's another reason, though, that I think Betty Crocker became so nationally famous. Washburn Crosby in 1924 launched an on-air radio show. It was first called it was initially called the Gold Medal Home Service Talks. They later renamed it the Betty Crocker Cooking School of the Air. It debuted on a Minneapolis radio station and was a huge success. It spread nationwide pretty quickly. You could just listen to the show if you wanted, or you could actually enroll in the classes. If you wrote down the recipes, tested them out, and sent Washburn Crosby a report about your results, they would send you back a certificate of completion if you finished an entire radio season's course. The very first year's class numbered 238, which is pretty good for that early in radio. The very first voice of Betty Crocker belonged to this woman, a home economist named Marjorie Child Husted. She was the company's field rep in home economics. She established the original writing voice of Betty Crocker, the tone, the phrasing, that kind of kind advice that Betty Crocker gave out. And she was perfect for this. She had studied education in college. She knew the importance of kindness and compassion. She'd worked with the Red Cross during World War I. But she also, and this was important, had business expertise. She had worked for a top pasta brand before she went to Washburn Crosby. All of her Betty Crocker letters and radio scripts had this compassionate but expert voice. And notice how she's seated in this image. She's not in a kitchen wearing an apron. She's behind a desk. She's got a telephone there. She's a businesswoman, but she looks friendly and approachable nonetheless. At first, Husted was also the actual voice of Betty Crocker on the radio, but others actually replaced her. Agnes White Tizard, who you see here, she worked for the company as a home economist too. She voiced Betty Crocker for more than 20 years. Funny little side note, when the radio show first debuted, stations weren't that strong to transmit nationwide. So in the very early years, Washburn Crosby would write up the radio scripts and then send them out to radio stations around the country, and stations would hire their own actress to be the voice of Betty Crocker. So as you traveled the country in the early 20s, Betty Crocker would have a different voice wherever you went to. To give you an idea of just how influential this radio show was, consider this. The invention of the Toll House cookie. It was invented at the Toll House Inn in Whitman, Massachusetts, and originally became popular among the people who ate at the Toll House Inn. But it didn't become nationally enormous until after the Betty Crocker Cooking School on the Air featured the story of Ruth Wakefield, who you see here. She was the proprietor of the Toll House. The Betty Crocker Cooking School featured her and this cookie she had invented in a 1939 broadcast, and then chocolate chip cookies just swept the nation. In other words, this radio show could make a recipe nationally a super celebrity. Betty Crocker's cooking school on radio was on the air for 24 years. More than 1 million listeners enrolled in the actual cooking school. And later on, do I have another picture? Here she is, Mrs. Husted. She actually gave interviews about why she thought the radio show was so influential. And she said she thought the work she did as Betty Crocker gave women a real sense of importance. It recognized that cooking and baking were not insignificant chores. They were important skills. They took some expertise. It could be mastered. You just needed help from, someone like Betty Crocker. But it was all about treating homemaking as an art and encouraging people to see homemaking as an art. She said that in a 1948 speech to the newspaper Food Editors Conference in New York. And I think that's important because homemaking is not something that is usually accorded an important sense of its artistry and skill. Betty Crocker really emphasized that. Now, I should back up for a minute and say Betty Crocker was not unique in playing this role. In fact, if you go back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s, she was just one of many fictional spokespersons. For example, Swift Shortening had a woman named Martha Logan, equally fictional, but she gave out advice and provided recipes. Same with Irma Harding. She was the fictional spokesperson for International Harvester. International Harvester was trying to sell refrigerators and freezers to rural homeowners, homemakers, and they kind of reasoned that women would be much more receptive to advice on refrigeration and freezing and recipes coming from a friendly but expert woman. At Pillsbury, there was Anne Pillsbury. It goes on and on. These fictional women, we might call them today, if we were in a business class, living trademarks. The idea being they were designed to put a friendly face on what was really a much larger food corporation. When you're vying for customers' attention, it helps to have a person that seems to create an almost one-on-one relationship. But I think it's important to remember all of these fictional spokespersons were backed by real people in the sense of there were real home economists testing the recipes, writing the advice letters and the columns and things like that. In other words, these home economists had genuine expertise, genuine authority, but they weren't working under their own name. They were working in this sort of bizarre world where the line between reality and fiction is somewhat optional. We don't see these fictional trademarks very much anymore. Typically today, if we see a human trademark, it'll be something like Martha Stewart or Rachel Ray, which are actual living people backing up that corporation. We do, though, have some fictional trademarks that still exist. Can you think of any? Here's one example. Miss Chiquita of Chiquita Banana. I don't know if I can move my thumbnail so you can see her up there. She was invented by a cartoonist for the Chiquita Banana Company in 1944, but I include her as a living trademark because she did have a voice. She was given a radio voice in the 1940s, and actually to this day, you can hear her singing a song, right? If anyone wants to sing it, you're welcome to. I won't subject you to that. One of the oldest of these fictional trademarks has actually been in the news in 2020, and that is Aunt Jemima. Aunt Jemima was invented to help sell this pancake brand. The pancake mix had actually come about in the 1880s. But in 1893, the company hired actual women to dress up as old-fashioned Southern mammies and make pancakes at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. That proved to be such a hit that the company started hiring for many decades other women to dress up as Aunt Jemima and travel the country. These actually coexisted with Betty Crocker and other living brands, although she's rarely mentioned by professional colleagues who also played fictional characters. Aunt Jemima has come into the news recently because it's been recognized that trademark, the depiction of the subservient Southern mammy, and the fact that she's being referred to as aunt, which was typical for Black women in the American South for many decades, was rooted in a kind of subservient stereotype that is no longer seen as appropriate in today's world. During World War II, Betty Crocker became something of an activist. This is a booklet they put out called Your Share. It was provided to homemakers to help out with things like how to cook when you're working with rationed foods. During the war, many foods were actually rationed. So this little booklet had ideas for things like menus for lunch boxes to go out and even recipes. I love this recipe. This is emergency steak. You mix together ground beef with some onion and milk and Wheaties, and you pat it into the shape of a T-bone steak. You can add some little strips of carrot to look like the bone, and then you broil it, and voila, 1 pound of ground beef can be stretched to serve 6 people. This was actually such a good recipe, they kept it in many of the later Betty Crocker cookbooks. The wonderful thing about it, though, actually, other than the fact that by now Washburn Crosby had evolved into being part of General Mills, and it just so happens that Wheaties is another General Mills product. But it does show how General Mills was working to be of genuine value to homemakers during World War II. About 7 million copies of that booklet were distributed. Betty Crocker was actually at the height of her popularity in the 1940s. She was receiving up to 5,000 letters a day. She was said to be the second most recognized woman in the world behind only Eleanor Roosevelt. About 99 out of 100 homemakers in America were said to recognize the name Betty Crocker. And then it nearly all came to an end. In April of 1945, Fortune magazine ran this article about General Mills. It started out very complimentary. It noted that what radio had done for FDR in politics, Betty Crocker had done on the radio, radio had done for Betty Crocker in terms of home economics. But it then outed Betty Crocker as fictional. It sort of positioned her as a bit of a fake, a fraud. It revealed what had been kept secret by General Mills for many decades, that there was no Betty Crocker. So the question is, are consumers going to be infuriated that they've had the wool pull over their eyes? In other words, will there be a backlash to this kind of fictional character that's been perpetrated on them? As it turns out, and I think this is significant, not at all. There was no decline in Betty Crocker's appeal after this ad came out. And I think that's telling, because I think what it indicates is that Betty Crocker didn't really need to be real. She was playing an important, even crucial role for American women during the wartime. This is April of 1945. We're still enmeshed in the last months of the war. For many American homemakers, Betty Crocker was giving them a sense that the work that they did during the war was important. It was valuable. That a woman preparing healthy meals for her family using ration food was performing an important war work. That sustaining your family, providing nourishing meals was an act of not just love, but of patriotism. As long as she was able to play that role, she was beloved by millions and needed by millions. Now, I say that this article revealed her to be fictional, but what about that drawing, right? That painting, that image of Betty Crocker, which you see here, and you saw it on that 1930s ad I showed earlier. Who in the world is that woman? Well, that woman, as it turns out, was fictional too. The very first portrait of Betty Crocker, which fun trivia for you. You will almost always see Betty Crocker wearing red, usually red and white, and with brown hair and blue eyes. There are only a few instances, and this is one of them on the cover of the Betty Crocker picture cookie book, where she's wearing green. I show you that just because it's fun, fun trivia if you've never noticed. Here's the first illustration, though, of her in red. This was created by an artist named Nasa McMain in 1936. She was commissioned to create this portrait. She actually used a sort of consolidation of images of the home economists who worked at Washburn Crosby, which was really appropriate, right? They all had a kind of collective hand in Betty Crocker's initial success. That portrait would be used for more than 20 years, longer than any other Betty Crocker portrait. But in 1955, she got her first makeover. Here it is, actually. I love this ad. This is a cake mix ad, and it says, Betty Crocker's Cake Mix Secrets Help Husbands Beat Wives in cake baking contests from coast to coast. You'd probably never see an ad like that today. Here's the first revision. This was done in 1955. She looks a little bit more grandmotherly-like to me. This is one of the few times you'll see her smiling open-mouthed. You can see her teeth in this image, and she's got little white streaks in her hair. She looks a little bit older. In 1965, she got a bit younger look with a kind of Jackie Kennedy bouffant hairdo. It's always nice to have your portrait 10 years later make you look younger than you were. She's had periodic changes ever since, but almost always wearing red and with blue eyes and brunette hair. Here is 1980. Here is 1986. Someone said she's a kind of ageless 32 or so. For her 75th anniversary in 1996, a painter named John Stuart Ingle created this image, which is significant because she's got olive skin. She could possibly be from an ethnic background, but exactly what ethnicity is hard to say. Most images of her up to this point had had blue eyes. Now she's got brown eyes. This image was created in a really interesting way. General Mills got together a collection of about 3,000 photographs of women. From those, 5,000, which is still a lot, right? From those 5,000 photographs, they chose the 75 portraits that they thought best embodied the characteristics they wanted you to associate with Betty Crocker. John Stuart Ingle then digitally morphed those 75 photographs together to create a composite from which he painted this particular image. And what's significant about all of this is the first time that Betty Crocker looks a little bit ethnic. And I think that is telling you something about where the company is appealing to. This is the first time that you see a direct appeal to ethnicities other than the traditionally white, blue-eyed woman. But in fact, it's a bigger issue because when you look at the changes in these portraits of Betty Crocker over time, the changes in the look were not just updates. They're changes to reflect the qualities the company wanted you to associate with Betty Crocker, whether she is a grandmotherly dispenser of advice or a youthful but professional kind of an expert. In a much broader sense, this indicates what General Mills has done really well with Betty Crocker, which is to keep her evolving, to keep her always modern and reflective of the times, while at the same time always keeping her grounded in a few broad principles, namely what you do is important, when cooking and baking for your family is an act of love, it's a skill, but you can do it, you just need a little bit of help. In 1951, General Mills tried to make the leap to television. They hired Adelaide Hawley Cumming to play Betty Crocker on television. The funny thing is, Cumming was not much of a cook. She actually admitted she had little interest in anything domestic. But it didn't matter because what she had was charisma on the air and expertise in performing. She'd had her own radio program. She would act as Betty Crocker on television from 1949 all the way to 1964. Of course, one of the fun things is that she's actually a blonde, not a brunette. But that didn't really matter. What she conveyed was the quality they wanted to present in the 1950s, which was of Betty Crocker as an expert and a professional, but also warm and friendly and domestic. Let me play you just a little bit of a clip from Betty's first TV show to show you. You can see visually how they're positioning her that way. If you want to see the whole thing, you can go on YouTube. Let me just play a few moments from it.
Hello, everybody. On behalf of General Mills and its many and varied services, a warm welcome to our Betty Crocker kitchens.
You can see the whole thing, like I said, if you wanted to. But do you notice how she's professional? She's behind a desk. It's got a nameplate. But she looks domestic. She's got a little Peter Pan collar on. She looks like she could be in a house, maybe an office, maybe a house. It's hard to tell. It was well done. But unfortunately, the Betty Crocker television show never really worked. People seemed more able to accept Betty Crocker as a voice on radio than they were as a fully embodied person on television. Most of what Cumming did as Betty Crocker was making appearances on talk shows on television, or she actually made appearances on some sitcoms in the 50s. Here's one. Anyone recognize what show this was? This was the television sitcom version of the Burns and Allen show. She appeared in an episode where Gracie Allen is trying to bake a cake, and of course she can't do it until Betty Crocker shows up and helps her out. Gracie Allen, when you think about it, is actually the perfect complement to Betty Crocker because and this was pointed out by a historian named Laura Shapiro, one of my favorite food historians. She actually said Betty Crocker and Gracie Allen are perfectly compatible. Maybe because they both are this seamless kind of a blend of the real and the imaginary. Gracie Allen was a real person, but at the same time, she was a fictional character, Gracie Allen, who she portrayed on radio and TV. All through Betty Crocker's history, she has kept constantly evolving, constantly staying up to date, while staying committed to the goal of making food as an act of love. Here's a great promotion the company started that went for a long, long time. This was the Betty Crocker coupon program. It debuted slowly in the late 1920s. Initially, they actually put spoons in sacks of flour. But eventually it turned into coupons. You could collect these coupons and send them in for things like stainless flatware or silver-plated flatware. Moms would collect these for themselves or to put together hope chests for their daughters or their granddaughters. After a while, they started printing the coupons on Betty Crocker grocery products and a number of other products. In fact, by the time you get to the 70s, there's a whole catalog of items that you can get with Betty Crocker coupons. This program was not discontinued until 2006. That is a huge run for that promotion. In 1954, they debuted the Betty Crocker Search for the All-American Homemaker of Tomorrow. Did anyone here participate in this? This continued until 1977. If you didn't participate, it allowed high school students to compete for scholarships and other prizes based on written tests. They would test you on your knowledge of cooking and baking and other issues in household management. They took it very seriously, and there were some amazing prizes that you could get. The corporate kitchens, similarly, were continuously updated. They were always state of the art. Here's what they looked like in 1950s. I don't think I have ever been in a kitchen quite that neat when you've got 5 people baking at the same time, right? And those beautiful finished goods. Betty Crocker made a big change, though, in the 1940s. It was in 1941 specifically that the very first Betty Crocker grocery product debuted. Anyone want to guess what the first grocery product was? If you're like me, you might guess cake mix, right? It wasn't. The first Betty Crocker grocery product was a soup mix. As you might be able to guess, this was not terribly successful, but the next grocery product was, and that was the Betty Crocker cake mix. The very first cake mixes debuted in 1947. First was a honey spice cake mix, then a party cake mix, and devil's food cake mix. The party cake mix came in, you could sort of adapt it for vanilla or yellow, other flavors. Now, Betty Crocker was not the first company to put out a grocery cake mix. There had been other companies that did this as far back as 1935. There was a company called P. Duff and Sons, which got a patent for a cake mix in 1935 that required you to add fresh eggs, which is interesting. When you think about it, you don't have to have fresh eggs be added to a cake mix. The company could just produce a cake mix using powdered eggs. But Pete Duff recognized at an early date that there's a benefit to asking homemakers to add their own fresh eggs. It makes the homemakers feel more involved in the creative process. Betty Crocker really popularized this. Here's an ad from I think this is the early 1950s for Betty Crocker honey spice cake mix. And in the upper left, it says, "You add the eggs for that special homemade goodness." This idea is sometimes taught in business classes today. The idea that when you have to put some extra effort into it, the finished product becomes more valuable to you because you feel like you've made it. You've not just bought it sort of ready-made and ready to go. This was a big increase in sales for Betty Crocker cake mixes when they debuted. Let me show you an early television commercial for Betty Crocker cake mixes. What I want you to pay attention to in this commercial is whose actual face do you see? Notice that as the commercial goes along.
When you make a cake from a mix, which do you want? A fresh egg cake or a cake made with dried eggs? For higher, lighter, tastier cake, why, fresh eggs, of course. But remember, all cake mixes are not alike. Betty Crocker cake mixes are different. They call for your eggs, added by you at home. It's the only national cake mix brand that lets you add the eggs. There's a reason why there are no dried egg whites, no dried egg yolks in Betty Crocker cake mixes. When you add the eggs, you're sure to get finer cakes most consistently. 9 out of 10 homemakers in recent tests said Betty Crocker cake mixes gave them bigger, taller cakes than the dried egg cake mixes they tested. Yes, and better tasting cakes, too. Try Betty Crocker party cake mix for yellow, white, or spice cakes. And try Betty Crocker chocolate devil's food cake mix for rich, moist devil's food with genuine fresh egg goodness. Get Betty Crocker cake mixes today.
Did you notice how there's no actual Betty Crocker in that commercial? In fact, you never even see the face of the homemaker. You see her hands, right? Adding the eggs and mixing it. The only face you see is of presumably the husband. This is the 1950s. Probably that cake was made by the homemaker for some member of her family. The emphasis with the grocery products was much more so on the joy that it gives to the person receiving the finished product, the happiness it conveys, the love that it expresses. But nonetheless, it is true that that psychological issue that when you feel more involved in the creative process, you tend to value the finished product more. A housewife feels prouder of her baked goods when she has to put in a little bit of extra effort adding her own eggs. She feels like she's actually made something to show her love for her family. What disappeared with the grocery products was any sense that cooking and baking required any kind of skill or expertise. Betty Crocker sort of becomes the person who does most of the legwork for you. You even start to get Betty Crocker showing up in items for children. Anyone here bake their very first cake in an Easy Bake Oven? The Easy Bake Oven was launched in 1963, but in 1968, Betty Crocker started marketing cake mixes and frosting mixes to be used in the Betty Crocker Easy Bake Oven. That later, the Betty Crocker later teamed up with Kenner in order to make the Betty Crocker model of the Easy Bake Oven. So it was a really, and if you never had one, they were great. They were powered by light bulbs. They provided the heat that did the actual cooking, but the oven came with these little round cake pans, and you mix it up with a little spoon and spatula that they provided. In other words, in a really smart marketing move, Betty Crocker is starting to build a relationship with, and in many cases, it was girls from a very, very young age. And that would then hopefully translate into sales of cake mixes by the adult when these girls grew up. But Betty Crocker never lost her role as a helper and an advisor to homemakers, even though there was always an emphasis on the ease of creating things, like in this great illustration where pies and cupcakes and donuts are just flying out of the oven. In 1950, the company launched the first edition of the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook. Now, this cookbook debuted with an initial print run of 950,000. That is enormous for an initial print run. This cookbook had such massive sales at the beginning and has become so beloved. This particular edition is nicknamed Big Red because it has that distinctive red cover to it. So what was it that made this cookbook so incredibly popular? Well, number one, it didn't include recipes for bizarre foods or for complicated foods. It provided recipes for good everyday standards, things like how to make hard-boiled eggs, how to make macaroni and cheese, how to make meatloaf and tuna casserole. These are not exotic. They're everyday favorites, and the recipes are simple and easy, at least from the perspective of 1950. They are simple and easy. And in fact, they said that these recipes were triple tested because what they would do literally is solicit recipes from staff and from the general public, try them out in the kitchens, come up with streamlined recipes that were easy to follow and pretty foolproof, and then send out those recipes to be tested by individual homemakers. So these are everyday standards in approachable recipes that are pretty foolproof. And they really are. Here's a batch of chocolate chip cookies I made not too long ago using the Betty Crocker recipe. And if you follow the recipe as it's printed, they do tend to come out pretty consistently, pretty good. But of course, it wasn't just the recipes themselves that made this book so beloved. It was that it was a picture cookbook. It had photographs of not just the finished products, but step-by-step images. Here's the step-by-step process for making an angel food cake. Shows you what the egg whites look like when they're beaten to a stiff peak, what it looks like when you fold the sugar and flour in, what the finished cake looks like when it's ready to come out. Here it is, all laid out. If you've never separated an egg before, here's how you do it. If you've never frosted a cake before, here's how you do it. And it had menus, what to serve to an invalid child. It had time things for like how long to cook vegetables. Now, again, this is all rooted in 1950s cooking. If you, let's say, follow the time instructions they have here for green beans, you might find them a little overcooked for modern tastes. But that was kind of the point, right? To encapsulate the way people cooked in 1950 and provide almost a home economics class in a book. Of course, when you realize that in reflecting recipes, the way Americans were cooking and eating in those days, it very quickly became not just reflective of how Americans cooked, but also in a way prescriptive of how people cooked in those days, because many people, especially women who had never had a home economics class, or young women who are newlyweds and learning how to cook, are cooking the way that this cookbook tells them how to cook. Now, again, many of these recipes are typical of the 50s. As I was talking about when we first started, if you joined 5 or 10 minutes early, we were talking about gelatin salads. This initial cookbook edition had a lot of recipes for gelatin salads. There's a lot of ham loaves. That's why the cookbook has been revised over and over and over. It's gone through multiple changes, new editions with revised recipes and new covers. The edition that came out with this sort of Mondrian style blue and yellow and pink cover, this one debuted in 1961. This, by the way, tends to be the one most sought after on online auctions today. The 1969 version with a kind of pie-shaped montage of pictures. This is sometimes called the Red Pie Cookbook. But that 1950 edition was the one that embedded itself in many baby boomers' minds. So much so that in 1998, they published a facsimile edition of the 1951. It comes with a little foreword saying, yes, we know these recipes are outdated. The way Americans cook has changed a lot since 1950. But the memories of cooking with this cookbook, eating the recipes from this cookbook, had now become an indelible part of American popular consciousness. In other words, Betty Crocker is kind of leveraging her past history with what we would probably today call retro marketing. Every recipe you remember from your childhood or that your mother made you when you were young, it is in here. So if you really need to make a pink azalea cake, or let's say tomato aspic with chicken, here's the recipe right here as you remember it. Betty Crocker's cookbook today, and it's still being revised. Here's what the modern cookbook cover looks like. It is now in its 12th edition. It is still a bestseller. It has sold more than 75 million copies. And that's only the most popular of what are now more than 250 Betty Crocker cookbooks, dating all the way back to the 50s. In the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of cookbooks for newlyweds and for doing home entertaining, very popular, of course, in the 50s and the 60s. A lot of the very first Betty Crocker cookbook for boys and girls became a runaway bestseller. When you get to the 70s, you see the cookbooks reflecting a greater interest in cooking for time-crunched people, busy people. You also see the greater American interest in international cooking. By the time you get to the 1990s and the turn of the millennium, you see a lot of cookbooks reflecting the interest in healthy eating, like in the Healthy Heart Cookbook that you see here. In other words, again, you're seeing Betty Crocker evolve with the times to stay modern while still keeping that emphasis on easy, foolproof recipes. And that key point, which has been there from the beginning, that serving your family delicious food that you prepared yourself is an act of love. Sometimes it even becomes explicit. I want to show you one of my favorite Betty Crocker commercials. It's from 1984. Again, as you're watching this, pay attention to whose face you see and whose you don't, but also notice the imagery here is just on how much people love this Betty Crocker food.
Ooh, will you look at that? In more ways than one, you lead me on. You sweet talker, Betty Crocker. Yeah, you know my weakness. I can't resist. You leave me breathless. You did it again. With more than one way to my heart. You sweet talker, Betty Crocker.
Again, this is 1984, so that's probably the happy husband who is loving this food. Notice again that emphasis on the ease of making it and the joyfulness that it gives, the love that this food expresses. This kind of brings us up to today. So where are we today? Well, interestingly, Betty Crocker is still one of the most influential names in food today. Certainly, Betty Crocker has modernized her promotional efforts. If you go onto the internet today, the Betty Crocker website is one of the most extensive food websites out there, not to mention one of the ones most visited. I don't know about you, but the millennials and younger that I know don't use cookbooks anymore, right? They go online if they need recipes. The Betty Crocker website is one of the most visited food websites. Her Facebook page has 5.3 million fans. You can even go on YouTube and see videos of how to make popular, easy recipes. Let me show you one very briefly, because I want to show you how this video doesn't rely on the spoken word at all. In fact, for the most part, it's relying on imagery to show you how to make these lemon thumbprint cookies. That whole video was 38 seconds long. And in some ways, the briefness of the video, sort of without saying, this is quick and easy, conveys visually the idea that this is a quick and easy recipe. And of course, the lack of spoken word means that this video is useful even to people who are not native English speakers. Betty Crocker is now internationally known. There are not in every single country in the world, but certainly in many of them. To give you one example, in Brazil, Betty Crocker purchased a cake brand for a particular orange cake that is one of the most popular cakes in Brazil, and she has become closely associated with that particular cake mix. Notice in this image that red spoon. That red spoon actually was an evolution from that early Betty Crocker signature logo. In the early days, they just put the signature in a red oval. But starting in 1954, an ad company evolved it into an actual spoon. And that spoon has had only minor changes ever since. Here's what the modern spoon looks like. This is the most recognizable symbol of Betty Crocker today. In fact, the red spoon logo is much more used than an image of Betty Crocker today. Today, if you go to your local grocery store, you will find Betty Crocker products all over the store, certainly in the baking aisle. This is an image I took at my local grocery store not too long ago. You'll see it on cake mixes and cans of frosting and things like that. But you'll see it elsewhere in the store. You'll see that red spoon on suddenly salad mixes and hamburger helper and Bisquick, all kinds of brands that now fall under the Betty Crocker trademark and reflect just how trusted that Betty Crocker name has become. If you go onto eBay, first editions of the picture cookbook can sell upwards of $200 for first edition, first printings of them. You'll find lots that are, held together with masking tape and rubber bands, right? You cannot tour the Betty Crocker kitchens, unfortunately, anymore. You can't listen to the radio show either, but Betty Crocker Company does still have test kitchens where they do still to this day test out new recipes and develop new promotions for Betty Crocker products. In other words, Betty Crocker today is as well-known a name and as important a brand for American cooking and baking as she was at the height of her popularity in the 1940s. Here's a really good example of that. In 2015, the New York Daily News made up a list of the 8 most influential figures who never lived, the 8 most influential fictional figures in American history, and by golly, there was Betty Crocker right up there with the Marlboro Man and Uncle Sam and Barbie. This is truly remarkable for a woman who has been around for 99 years altogether. Let me finish up quickly with some book recommendations with a library group. I always want to include my favorite books if you're interested in learning more. My favorite book and kind of the standard work on Betty Crocker is a book by Susan Marks called Finding Betty Crocker. This is a really readable book. It's a lot of fun, great imagery. This is sort of the best modern overview of the history of Betty Crocker. Equally wonderful, although maybe a little bit more academic as a read, is a book by Laura Shapiro. She's a journalist, one of the great food historians, I think, of today. It's called Something from the Oven: Reinventing Dinner in 1950s America. It's not all about Betty Crocker, but there's an entire chapter about Betty Crocker in this book. And again, Laura Shapiro, she's very insightful, and she's a journalist, so it's more academic, but it's certainly not anything that is dense or unreadable. It's a very rewarding kind of a read. So Finding Betty Crocker and Something from the Oven are my two favorite books about Betty Crocker.
Well, thank you so much for answering everything we had. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful. We got a ton of compliments rolling in for you and our Q&A and
Thank you.
everywhere.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Happy baking.